Because what you can
in
do
a way,
is,
the questions are framed because they're framed mostly in America in a white Western.
no, most of it is actually how you solve puzzles and stuff like that. But, but I mean, what you can do is you can look at when you test people and find their IQ, and then you can look 20 years later at what they've become.
Yeah.
And that's why, when you find that always there is a very strong correlation between what they become 20 years later and what their IQ is, then obviously that's an indication that the IQ testing is pretty accurate at predicting what they'll end up doing.
That's an interesting point.
Yes.
I don't think we'll debate it right
No.
now.
No, that would be a problem, because then you would have to bring something into Australia that would be very unacceptable in Australian society.
No, just
Yes, absolutely.
No, lighting.
It's even difficult in Danish society, though certainly it's more acceptable in Danish society, because if you look at the comment section in the newspapers, there's about 40 or 50% who are writing, well, how can you punish him for saying the truth? I mean, we don't think that people who have IQ 70 are bad people. We don't think they're morally reprehensible. We don't think that they're less good people than people who have 140 IQ. But if you don't know the problem, then you can't fix it. And if the problem is you want IQ 70 people to be astronauts, then you need to find out why they can't become astronauts.
Okay, what's the average IQ in a country?
Well, that depends on the country, and that's a
yeah,
problem.
That's what I mean. Like, what are most countries?
Do you want to straighten your tie, please?
There is
and
so
just
in
sit
most
up a little
countries.
straighter.
In Denmark and most Western, in Denmark it's 98.
Right.
It's down from 102, but that's because we've been receiving migrants from low IQ countries, and obviously that's math. Then the average IQ will fall.
Right.
So 98 in Denmark. In Hong Kong it's 108.
Right.
And according to, I mean, the Danish courts, if a Hong Kong Chinese were to say to me, haha, Rasmus, I'm from Hong Kong and we have 108 average and you only have 98 average IQ, haha, that would be offensive. But I don't think that's offensive. I don't think it's a statement of fact. I mean, I think we're doing pretty well with IQ 98 average. But of course, some countries, as I mentioned, have considerably lower average IQ, and those are the countries that work very poorly.
Right.
I mean, South Africa with 77 is not working very well. Nor is Zambia with IQ 79 average, because it's a bell curve. Certainly, you read the bell curve, the very famous book. No,
It's very contentious. It's very contentious.
Oh, you know about it.
I do.
Yes.
Yeah.
In a country, the IQ will be like this, and that means that most people will have an IQ close to average. That's what we know. So it's not like that it's evenly divided. No, if you have, for instance, Denmark with an average IQ of 98, then the vast majority of Danes will have an IQ between 88 and 108. So it's not like there's equal amounts that have 70 and 130. No. It's very rare to be at both extreme ends. Most of them are reasonably in the middle. And that's why if you have a country with an IQ average of 77, well then most people will be around 77. And that's a problem, because there is no functional democracy in any country with an IQ lower than 90. That doesn't happen. And why doesn't it happen? Well, that's obvious. Because if you have such a low IQ, then your cognitive ability to foresee that voting for something that's good for everybody is not present. So you'll only vote for something that's good for yourself, and that doesn't work in a democracy.
We're ready.
Yeah. Good to go. Ready to clap?
Yes, please. Roll like that. Yep.
Just tell me who you are, which party you represent, and where you're from, and where we are.
Okay, well, so my name is Rasmus Paludan. I'm a leader of the Danish hardline party, Stram Kurs, and we're at my office right now in Copenhagen in Denmark.
Tell me a bit about you. Where did you grow up? What sort of childhood did you have?
Okay, well, so I grew up north of Copenhagen in a reasonably affluent area, and that was during that was in the 90s, so that was pretty happy a childhood, I guess. I mean, the big difference between then and now is that I saw very few migrants during my childhood, because the people I went to school with were Danes. Even the people I went to high school with were mostly ethnic Danes. And then after I finished high school, I was in the army briefly, and then I studied law, and now I'm a lawyer practicing attorney here in Denmark.
And when did you first start to see migrants a lot in your life?
Well, I would say that it certainly made a difference when I moved closer to the capital to start studying law in 2001, just at the beginning of the new millennium, and that was a big difference, because many of them were unable to speak proper Danish, and some of them behaved in a manner that was very different from what I'm accustomed to that Danes do. So in Denmark, we have a lot of emphasis on being restrained and showing temperance. So we don't yell at each other and we don't hit each other. For the most part, we don't hit each other either. And rather, if people act like that in social settings, like they yell and hit people, we frown on that. We don't think that's acceptable. But I found that some people from other cultures, they're the reverse. They think that if they yell a lot at people and hit them, then they consider them to be the winner on the battlefield. So that's a completely different kind of behavior. And I found that's from Muslim cultures and Muslim countries, and I didn't like that at all. I still don't like it.
Did that happen to you? I mean, did people yell at you?
Well, I wouldn't say, I don't think it's happened more to me than anybody else. I mean, I've met people that from those countries that are nice, and I met people from those countries that are less nice, but I don't think I had different experiences from most people, so certainly...
But I'm just wondering, was there a specific incident that occurred that you experienced that sort of shaped your views around this?
There's no specific incident that has occurred. For the most part, I've been fortunate enough to study law with people that have been ethnic Danes. So no, there hasn't been a specific incident, but certainly you can see that things are changing. And
but did someone ever hit you?
Well, I've certainly been assaulted by people, but not just by Muslims. I mean, I'm a person who speaks my mind, so certainly some people will react violently to that, but I would be ridiculous if somebody hit me and was a Muslim, and then I decided, well, now I don't like any Muslims, and then the next day somebody hit me who was a Dane, and then I said, well, now I don't like Danes either. So that doesn't work like that.
You gave that example of Muslims raising their voice and hitting people, so I was just wondering if you'd actually experienced that.
Oh, absolutely, but any Dane that has not completely barricaded themselves from the world has experienced that. That's very, very common.
So you've been physically attacked?
Oh yeah, but that's why I'm protected, because I'm...
But back then?
Oh, you mean before I became politically active?
Yeah, you were saying around 2001.
Well, no, not at that. I mean, I probably... I mean, I don't ask people who attack me whether they're Muslims, but I've been in a few incidents during the years, but that isn't... Some of them have been white, some of them has been less white. I mean, it's nothing that has really influenced my position. The things that have influenced my position is the overall impression of what is happening in the country, and that's very terrifying. And of course, also that I've been seeing what happens in other countries that are close to us, Germany, Sweden, Britain, and so forth.
I thought you said that you observed Muslims hitting people and raising their voice.
No. I observed the Muslims are doing this, but it's not like it's a personal encounter. I mean, certainly, if you're out and about in the nightlife and otherwise, you see things, but that doesn't mean that you're a participant in those incidents. And I wasn't a participant in those incidents, but certainly if you're walking down the street and you see 5 Muslim males in their late teens or early 20s, and they're antagonizing or being very insulting towards someone who's alone, then that sends an impression. More so if you see it 10 times over. So that's what I meant.
Am I right in thinking that you started your political life on the left?
No.
Were you sort of more to the left of where you are now? Or have you always sort of been where you sit politically?
Well, I've always had the opinions that I have. It's taken some time to realize what the proper solution is, but certainly that also depends on when you see the problem. I mean, I couldn't foresee in 2001 what the result would be of the policies then. Now I have a better position to foresee what the result will be of the policies now, considering that now we've seen what happened the past 18 years, and that has been completely terrible, and that has changed our country in a way that's unimaginable. I mean, in the blink of an eye, Denmark has been changed from an ethnically homogeneous, safe, peaceful country with a very high degree of social trust, to a country where people are very much afraid and do not trust each other very much anymore. So, and considering how long it took to build the country that we had in 2001, it's very, very scary and terrifying to see how that can be completely destroyed in such a short time span.
I'm just trying to understand your own political journey, I guess. So I want to sort of understand how you've ended up being in this position, you know, clearly quite unique in Denmark, where you're protected by heavy security, a lot of money is spent on sort of caring for you, as it were. From what you're saying, it wasn't always like that. So I'm just trying to understand the sort of political journey that you've gone on yourself. Was there a particular turning point? Did something happen in your experience of life that changed your mind, that made you feel as strongly as you do?
No. But there was something that made me change my mind as to what I had to do about it. And that was when I was teaching law students in the autumn of 2015. It's not unusual in Denmark, if you're a lawyer and you're reasonably bright, that you're allowed to teach law students at university part-time. That's pretty normal, actually. And I did that in 2015, and I had 2 different classes. And the one class I taught was people who were just 1 year into law school, so they were almost straight out of high school, basically. These were 20-year-olds, basically. And they filed a complaint against me with the dean of the legal faculty. And the complaint was that they had read on my private Facebook profile that I had linked to an article from Gatestone Institute where it said that because of the migration crisis, all the people coming with smugglers who came here claiming refugee status, even though they only wanted our money and hated us and our way of life very much. Because of this crisis, the influx of people we don't want who hate us, there was also a great rise in the number of European females being raped by Muslim males from elsewhere. And my basic comment to that was that if you're a Muslim male and you come into Europe and rape European females, then you should not be allowed to be in Europe. That was what I wrote as a comment when I posted that article on Facebook. I don't know any politicians in Denmark who disagree. I mean, I haven't heard of the party that says it's a poster party for let's bring all the rapists into Europe and let them rape European women. I mean, I haven't heard about that. So I didn't think that statement was very controversial. I thought this was something everybody could agree on, that we don't want rapists into Europe. Where would you want rapists? Certainly not Australia either, I'm sure. So that's what I wrote, but they complained. They thought that my statement was very extremist, so I shouldn't be allowed to teach students because I had extremist views. Now, that's absurd under Danish law, because as long as I don't say anything about my political opinions when I teach, obviously that would be a problem. I'm allowed to have my opinion in private like I want. I mean, I'm allowed to make political statements in my private life as long as they don't influence teaching by, telling the students, I only give you A's if you agree with me. That would be obviously wrong. So there was no cause for dismissal or any kind of discipline based on that complaint. So of course nothing came from that as regards my employment. But what did come from that was that I became very concerned, because these people who filed that complaint would be making important decisions in their jobs 4 years later when they were finished in law school. And if they already thought that we could have what's in German called Berufsverbot, which means that you can be a political dissident that's barred from having certain office positions, then that's a problem for democracy. So that made me very concerned. I had the same opinions. I had those for years because I saw my country going straight to hell. But at that point, I became so concerned that I thought I'm called to do something, because this is happening a lot faster than I thought it would. So I started going to the Free Press Society meetings in the autumn of 15, and in January 16, I went to the first Danish Pegida protest, and I did that for the entire year of 16. And on the 1st of October 16, I held a speech at one of those Pegida protests, and that speech has been dubbed the Rivers of Blood speech, because I warned about an impending civil war in Denmark. If this evolves, if the same path continues, then the conflict between Muslims and Danes will eventually reach a boiling point, and if the police are unable, because they're too few, to deal with this, then eventually some people will take up arms against each other.
Is that what you think will happen?
That's something that can happen, certainly.
But is that what you think will happen?
I am not a predictor of the future, so I don't know what will happen, but I think it certainly can happen. I mean, I spoke with...
Denmark will go to war with itself.
Sure, that can happen, but that, I mean, basically, this is not something controversial. I interviewed Claire Lopez, a former CIA agent, now Vice President of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. I interviewed her in December last year, and she said, you know, the Muslim takeover in Europe strategically will happen like this, that there will be enclaves where Muslims rule, where the police of a certain specific country can no longer enforce the rule of law set by the Danes, and those enclaves will become bigger and bigger, and they will have their own police eventually, and then that's how it will evolve. And that's pretty much in line with what I said. I mean, if you have enclaves where the Danish officials can no longer rule, then that's a step towards civil war, because most countries in Western Europe will not accept that there are places they can no longer rule. So certainly at this point they do accept it, but only to a smaller degree. I think that if Britain experienced that the entire province of Cornwall said that now we're Cornwallsdalat because they were taken over by Muslims, I think Britain would react very harshly to that. But of course, we have cities in Britain where they already have taken over. I mean, London has a Muslim mayor, and he is overseeing the biggest knife attack ever in London, because he's spending all the police money on going back to white Britons and telling them that they shouldn't write criticism against Muslims. So it's already happening. But
do you think that knife crime in London is happening because the mayor is Muslim?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It's a question of how you prioritize the Metropolitan Police, and if you prioritize
But what's his faith got to do with that?
The fact that he has done a complete re-swap of how the Met prioritize their resources, and they have to use a lot of resources against Britons who write critically about Muslims online, instead of patrolling the streets to stop knife crimes being committed by Muslims. So obviously his faith has everything to do with that.
So I'm not seeing the connection.
Why are you seeing the connection?
I don't really understand what you're saying. He's reprioritized spending because he's a Muslim.
He has reprioritized spending because he's a Muslim, and therefore he thinks the police should spend a lot of resources on people who write critically against Islam.
Because white nationalism is an issue in Britain, right?
No, it is not.
Right.
The issue is Islamic terrorism, which has happened in Britain many, many times. In 2005, for instance, a friend of mine had taken the subway only 20 minutes before the bombing occurred on the Piccadilly line. So that's very terrible. I mean, white nationalism is not something to worry about at all.
Even though an MP was killed by a white nationalist?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Obviously, it's a shame that an MP was killed, but as you may be aware, far more people were killed in the 2005 attacks in London, and also,
yeah,
of course...
I was actually on one of the trains, but yeah.
Who?
I was on one of those trains.
Okay, well, you weren't killed.
Yeah.
Yeah. But of course, I mean, the basic problem is that most people, Anglo-Saxons and Western Europeans, are brought up with the absurd belief that everybody are like themselves, that they have the same kind of ethical and moral standards and values. And that's why it's very difficult for you to imagine that an elected mayor would prioritize the police resources based on his own personal opinion and religious belief.
But it's an objective fact that there is an issue with white nationalism in the UK. Do you dispute that?
You have to define what an issue with white nationalism is, and then I can make a statement.
Well,
as to that.
I think you acknowledged that the murder of Joe Cox was related to white nationalism, didn't you?
Well, that's what you said, and I acknowledged that an MP was killed. You said an MP was killed, and I agreed that an MP was killed.
And you don't think that was associated with white nationalism?
Well, I think he was dissatisfied with her positions, but certainly that's a lone wolf attack. As you know, all Muslim attacks are also lone wolf attacks. So I'm certainly going to appreciate that. Then obviously all the other attacks have to be lone wolf attacks as well, right? We don't have a Muslim problem. I mean, sure, there are a few Muslims that are terrorists and kill innocent people, but I mean, they're not really Muslims. All the peaceful Muslims are the majority, and they're not a problem. I'm sure you're a subscriber to that.
To be honest, I'm confused about what you're saying. But
in Denmark, we use a lot of irony. When we think that a journalist is way out in his questioning, in his line of questioning, and completely absurd and insulting towards Danes, then sometimes we use irony to diffuse the situation.
Right.
I think your line of questioning is very, very ignorant. And I think...
Why is that?
Because you want to talk about white nationalism like that's an issue, when the whole Western European group of countries are being destroyed by Muslim migrants and Muslim terrorism. So then you bring up...
how is Denmark being destroyed?
Well, the same way Sweden is, only at a slower pace. I mean...
But how is that? You're talking to an Australian audience. What has happened to Denmark that you feel demonstrates it's being destroyed?
I can't answer that question because it's not dependent on my feelings. So I understand that you feel a lot, and that's a problem when you're a journalist. Otherwise you wouldn't ask questions about feelings. But I don't feel. I see the facts and then I act accordingly.
Tell me what the facts are.
The facts
How is
are
Denmark being destroyed?
The facts are that we have a great rise in unemployment among the migrants because the people who are coming here are either unwilling or unable to work for the most part. The ones that are willing and able to work are the ones who are coming from countries that are very similar to Denmark. So that means that ethnic Norwegians and Swedes and Icelanders and Germans, they come and work and they're very fit to do so, as are most people from most European countries, because they're pretty related to Danes. And certainly that's also true for Americans and Australians and New Zealanders. I mean, even though it may be difficult for you to understand because I guess you're bound by the culturally Marxist, postmodernist, feminist agenda in Australian media, you and I are actually far more related heretically than you are to many of your so-called countrymen who are Muslims. Because...
So why? Explain that to me.
Sorry?
Explain why we're more closely related than someone that's a Muslim that lives here and has done for their whole life.
Because you are from, originally you're from Western Europe. And then some of your forefathers probably went to Australia. And therefore your genes are very much bound to Western Europe, even though you've been born somewhere else. Whereas someone who's a Muslim, of course there are Danish converts and they're ethnically Danes, and that's sad, but that's true. But if we put those apart, they're very few. Then the Muslims living here are from somewhere else. Now it's true that if you're Pakistani and a Muslim and you're born in Denmark, you are born in Denmark. But as you are probably aware, I think I told you this yesterday, that if a dog is being born in a stables with horses, that dog is not a horse. And that's true here as well. Just by being born somewhere doesn't make you a part of that ethnic group.
It does make you a citizen, doesn't it?
Not necessarily, but that all depends on the law in that country that you're born. I mean, certainly some countries have the rule that if you're born on that soil, then you're automatically a citizen. But many countries do not. Denmark certainly doesn't have that rule, and that's good. Otherwise, we would be in a far worse state. But obviously, to be a Dane, you have to be an ethnic Dane, or as I told you yesterday, either a Danish Jew or someone adopted in your early childhood by Danish parents. And the reason...
So why does a Danish Jew make the cut but not a Muslim born here?
Well, that's very easy, because Danish Jews embrace Denmark. They love Denmark.
What about the Muslims that love Denmark?
No Muslims love Denmark, but certainly many Muslims love the money of the Danes. That's true.
But isn't that just your opinion? Because there are Muslims that are Danish citizens that say they love Denmark just as much as you claim to.
Well, yeah, that's true.
It's your opinion.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
So what's the proof?
Well, the proof is that when you make questionnaires for the Muslims in Denmark and you ask them about basic Danish values, then you find out that their values are completely contrary to what the Danes think and what we have held dear for many years. And that shouldn't be a surprise. You shouldn't even have to do those questionnaires, because anybody who knows anything about Islam, obviously not you, but people who actually have studied Islam, are aware that all Islam's teachings are completely contrary to what we hold dear in Western Europe. In Islam, a female is worth half as much as a male because she is female. In Islam, if you're gay, then you have to be thrown out from a high place, and if you don't die when you fall, then you have to be stoned to death. And in Islam, there is no law given by man that is higher than the law given by God, by Allah. That always, Sharia always has to take precedence. All those things are completely contrary to Danish values and to living and being a Dane. Also, by the way,
So
to being an Australian. But the
So you
problem.
think all Danish Muslims believe that?
Well, we had a questionnaire, and they said 78% said that they agreed that the Islam religious laws must be above Danish laws. But
that wasn't my question, because you just gave a long list of things that you said Muslims believe.
Yes.
And I'm asking you.
No, I didn't say Muslims believe it. Muslims do believe that. It's not a point for me.
But my question is, do you think that all Danish Muslims subscribe to all of those beliefs, pushing gays off buildings, stoning them to death? Is that what you think all Danish Muslims believe?
It doesn't matter what I think. It's a fact.
It does, because
Do I think water is wet? Yes, I think water is wet. Do Muslims subscribe to the views I've expressed that are from Islam? Likewise, like water is wet. The only way that's going to change is on the day that the sun rises in the west and the sea is as dry as the deserts. So obviously that's Islam. And you can like that or not.
Oversimplify.
No, Islam is a very simple religion, and because of
these
your
are not simple people, right? These are human beings that have their own minds and live in Danish society. I'm just wondering if you're oversimplifying.
You're very what do you call that? It's a word. You're very biased.
Right.
You have a lot of bias and presumptions about Muslims. You think that they are reasonably like you,
right?
And they're not. And this is interesting because most Danes think that as well. I think. I mean, not most anymore, but certainly some, and I'm sure most Australians do as well. And that's funny and sad, but it's also funny because the fact is the way that Australians and Danes and Western Europeans and Americans and Canadians and Kiwis live their lives is actually, if you look at it globally, very diverse. That's the small minority that are living strange lives. The vast majority of people in the world live very different lives, have very different values. So when you think they're human people, human beings too, you're implying that probably they think reasonably about things like you and I do, and they don't. There's no evidence for that.
You think Muslims are not human beings?
Well, they're not human beings.
Rational beings.
Oh, absolutely not. But no, you can laugh that off because it's easier for you to hold to very closely to the ignorant perception that everybody is like you. Because if they're not, there is the risk that they're worse than you. It could be that the empathy you have for other people is something that many people in the world don't have. Or maybe they only have it for their own family or their own clan. Maybe the empathy you have for Australians, maybe your willingness to fight for Australia if Australia is attacked, is something that many people don't have. Maybe they don't only have that for their kin, for their family or clan. And the fact is, that is the truth for many people in the world. And in some cases, they're different in a way that works out pretty well as long as we don't live too closely together. For instance, our cooperation with the Chinese is pretty good. I mean, the Chinese are not unreasonable people. They're different than us, that's for sure, but they're not unreasonable. But in some cases, the culture of people is so much in conflict and in opposition to what we believe that it is a problem. So no, it's absolutely wrong if you think that people who are adherent to Islam, that the vast majority of those are reasonable people that have the same kind of empathies and sympathies that you and I do. Even though I know that you're thinking that I shouldn't compare myself to you because I'm sitting here criticizing so many people and we are so different, but really that's because of your limited mind, because the reality is you and I are very much alike, and we are the minority. And many other people in the world, the most people, are very different. And in some cases, you know, that's fine. Actually, I would say that as long as they don't meddle with my country, I'm actually fine with them being different. That's why I'm saying in the 51 Muslim countries, I wish all the Muslims the very best. I mean, I wish that they live long, happy lives as they define long and happy lives. I just don't want them to do in Denmark, because when they're here, they make sure, unfortunately, by being what they are, that we live not very long lives and not very happy lives.
So I met some young men in Vosmosa the other day, and one of them was a 19-year-old boxer who I think had met you when you visited. And you told him that he would never be a Danish citizen. Can you explain that?
Well, I don't know who that was, so I can't really answer that other than saying that certainly if you're a criminal, then you're not fit to live in Denmark, unless of course you're born here. Then born here as a ethnic Danish citizen. Then we'll have to deal with it. But I don't know who that person is. It's interesting though.
So
that
you would have made assumptions in saying that you'll never be a Danish citizen.
Well, certainly if you're an Arab Muslim, you will never be a Danish citizen.
But I mean, he is actually a Danish citizen.
Yeah. Well, he will never be a Dane. Certainly, I haven't said that he will never be a Danish citizen because
I think that's what you told him.
No, I told him you will never be a Dane. In Danish, you can say you'll never be a Dane, and you can say you'll never be a Danish citizen. There are many people who are Danish citizens who will never be Danes. So he's saying that, obviously that's a lie. But I may very well have told him that he will never be a Dane, because that's the truth, obviously. But if he's a Danish citizen, that's good for him and bad for us. But it's very interesting that...
What does it take for him to be considered properly Danish?
Well, if he's an ethnic Dane, you would know. And if he's not, you will also know. It's very easy. Do you have difficulty with the ethnicity concept?
Well, I have difficulty with understanding what defines a Danish citizen and what doesn't. Because I mean, he...
No, you're saying Danish
he said
citizen.
repeatedly... Yeah, I mean, you've just said that he's lying. I can't really understand why multiple people would make up the same account of one interaction. But
well, I don't know who these multiple people are. But if you show me the evidence, I will be happy to comment on it. Otherwise, I'll have to assume that you're lying.
So, why
are you lying?
People? You can make your own judgment.
No, I'm just asking you because you seem to me like a person who would be very willing to make up things to further your own political agenda.
Right.
So it's interesting for me whether you're bald-faced lying to me. So,
if that's where you want to assume.
Are you lying about this? It's very interesting for me to know. If you're not lying, why don't you show me the evidence?
So a young man I met said that that's what you told him, and I'm curious to understand it.
Okay.
So
well, I
have
have told many people that they're not Danes and they will never will be. As many Arab Muslims have told me that they think they are more Danish than I am, which is very offensive and ludicrous. But certainly they're entitled to say that under the Danish law of freedom of speech until they return to their homelands, which they will be eventually.
What do you think of a young guy like that who, I think he's been voted the Citizen of the Year there. He is a champion boxer, he's joining the Danish army, he has a job, he has an education. Do you think a guy like that is bad to have in this country?
I don't know the person you're talking about, so I have no idea. If you come from somewhere else and you love the Danish values and you have a job and you contribute to society, and there's
all of which he says he does,
and there's a reason for being here. For instance, if you're born here, then you can be a valued foreigner. And if you're a valued foreigner, then you're allowed to stay. And I think that's fine. I don't think it's very good that a person from a culture of violence decides to take up boxing. I don't think that's furthering his ability to be harmonious, be in harmony with Danes. I think that is maybe furthering his ability or willingness to further his own cultural agenda. Because when he's from a violent culture and wants to live in Denmark, I wouldn't choose boxing as something to spend my time on. That's a very, very violent sport. And that's also a sport where your skills can be used outside the arena of the sport. So I think that speaks volumes. And the fact that you've been unable or unwilling to see that point, which is so obvious, I think also should maybe give you some cause for self-reflection.
He's joining the army. Does that bother you?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I don't think that Muslims in Denmark should have weapons training or weapons. The terrorist attack we had here in February 15 was committed by a person who used arms stolen from the Danish armed forces, and he killed 2 innocent people, a Danish instructor, a Danish director of movies, and a Danish Jew outside the synagogue. So obviously, yes, that bothers me that someone from a violent culture and a violent religion decides to take up a violent sport like boxing and then decides to join the army. There is so much violence in all those things.
Tell me about what we witnessed yesterday with you in the park. You were throwing a Quran. I know you've done other things with Qurans in the past. What are you trying to achieve?
What other things are those?
I understand there was an incident involving throwing it previously. I think there was some bacon involved in one of the incidents as well. I just would like to understand what the purpose is.
Right, okay. Well, I haven't personally put bacon on any Quran. What I have done with the Quran is that I have thrown it as sports, and then I've torn out pages from it, which is completely legal. Other people during the process that I've supervised have done things, and I think that's fine. Actually, I think it's very good. As I told you yesterday, in Denmark, as in Australia, we have a lot of Muslims, and some of those are radicalized extremists. And they think they should decide what people are allowed to do with the Quran. So, because they're very offended by someone doing stuff with the Quran, for instance, throwing it or burning it or things like that, they believe that the proper course of action is to kill that person. And so to make sure that others don't do the same thing, because they will also be afraid of being killed. Now, for someone who loves freedom of speech, which I do, obviously you don't, but I do, that's terrifying. That would be very sad if that was the state of affairs in this country. In 2017, Parliament made the excellent decision of abolishing the blasphemy section in the Penal Code. So now it's completely legal to burn the Quran. Previously, it might not have been, because the police indicted someone for doing just that, and Parliament acted so that that case could no longer be furthered, because it was no longer a crime. So because of this, you would think that many Danes would show their disgust for Islam by desecrating the Quran. That's a very clear way of sending a message to Muslims and other proponents of Islam that we don't like Islam. But that didn't happen. Now, certainly for some people, it didn't happen because they either like Islam or they don't care about Islam. Those would be the people who are wealthy. Those would be wealthy white journalists like you, who earn a lot of money telling lies to people. They live in neighborhoods where they're reasonably protected from Muslims, because Muslims don't live in those upscale, affluent neighborhoods. I'm sure you have those kinds of neighborhoods in Australia as well, where you live, and it's very nice to live there, and other people just like yourself live there, and you're not really bothered by the negative influx of unskilled, hateful people. So obviously those people wouldn't want to burn the Quran because they don't care, or maybe even they believe that Islam is the religion of peace and that we're being enriched by all those Muslim invaders, and certainly you're allowed to have that opinion, and that's, if the majority thinks so, then eventually that majority will be slaves to Islam. But many people in Denmark don't appreciate Islam, because, especially young people, because people like you, with your age and position, are able to barricade themselves reasonably well in social settings from being confronted with criminal Muslims. That's pretty easy if you're an adult and you have money. But if you're a child between the ages of 8, 7, and 18, then for the most part, you're forced to be in settings where you will experience what it's like to be together with Muslims, in school, in kindergarten, and so forth. And there, if you experience Muslims like Muslims are for the most part, you'll think, well, that's funny, there was this guy throwing a Quran on TV, his name was Rasmus, and everything he says about what Islam is like is what I've just experienced. So of course, that explains why so many young people in Denmark like me. But they don't burn the Quran regardless. So it's not because, sorry?
It's okay.
It's not because, I'll just turn this off.
You might like to straighten your tie.
All right, thank you. It's not because they don't want to. They do want to, because they know that what I'm saying about Muslim culture and Muslim behavior is true. They've experienced it themselves. So it's not because I'm very convincing and then they say, we didn't really think that, but now we're convinced because Rasmus is so great at telling us what the truth is. That's not the reason at all. The reason is that I'm saying something is a certain way and they experience just that. And then they say, okay, that's interesting. He said things were like that, and that sounded kind of extremist, but Now we experience it ourselves, and it's just like that. So it's not that they don't want to do it with the Quran, but they're afraid of getting killed. Of course, I don't like that situation. I want people to do with the Quran and the Bible and any other book, the Torah or the Marxist manifests from Marx, or the Communist Manifesto, whatever you want to do with any book that you own, you should be allowed to do.
Have you done it with other books?
No.
Why not?
Because the people who love those books very much don't kill people who desecrate those books.
Have you tested that?
That has been tested.
By you though?
No, not by me. But I would, if I had the faintest suspicion that anybody would object violently to me doing that, I would be happy to do it. Because I think the day that somebody is standing up and saying, I'm a Christian, if somebody does something with the Bible, I'm going to go after them, then that's the day we'll start burning Bibles. But the reason obviously is they're afraid, and therefore we want to do some things with the Quran to show people that they shouldn't be afraid, and to show Muslims that if they're offended by this, they cannot and must not react with violence and murder. And if they're in a position where they're very offended and they're unable to react with violence and murder because they're prevented from doing that by the police and other agencies, then there is a third option. And that third option is they can leave. And that will be a very nice day for Denmark.
Do you think people look at you throwing the Quran in the air and think, this guy's a hero, or do they think you're just standing in a park seeking attention?
Well, I think there are far more views than those two you expressed. I think that our supporters obviously think that I'm a hero because I'm doing something very dangerous because that's in line with my beliefs. But I would say that the other people in that case yesterday were heroes as well. They also threw the Quran in the air and participated with me. So
is it a cry for attention? Is that what you want from doing that?
A cry for attention?
Yeah.
Are you aware how famous I am in Denmark?
Yeah.
Okay, well then
for doing that?
No, not for doing that. I'm famous in Denmark because when I did that twice, 2 throws on the 14th of April, a whole neighborhood in Copenhagen rioted and set the streets ablaze and committed grave crimes against the police and attacked the police physically, and maybe even tried to kill some police officers.
Do you take any responsibility for that?
Do I take responsibility for other people being violent?
Yeah.
No. Do you think that you should take responsibility for people being violent when they see what you're doing?
I'm just asking whether you think what you did led to a sequence of events or not.
Okay, so by that line of argumentation, I guess you think that if some female wears
it's not about
a sexual...
I'm asking what you
No, but you're...
Do you take any responsibility?
I take absolutely no responsibility for the violent actions of other people. Nor do I think that you being very offensive should make you responsible for other people committing violence, if that is the case at some point. You should take responsibility for your actions, and as long as you're not violent, then certainly you don't have responsibility for other people being violent, and the same goes for me. And as you may know, I'm not a violent person. No other people are violent, so that's that, and that's why I'm famous in Denmark. But also, I mean, to be fair, I'm more famous because that event, that rioting, led to me and my party being able to run for the parliamentary elections very quickly, and nobody had seen that coming. So basically, my fame is because of the speed at which we were able to be eligible to run for parliament. Of course, also for the result, because 1.8% is a pretty good result when you only have 1 day to prepare your election campaign. So those are the reasons. I'm not famous for actually throwing the Quran in the air, at least not in the general public. I think in the youth I'm probably famous for my videos where I confront the Muslims who are doing what most Muslims, or many Muslims and Danes do all the time, which is what I described for you in the beginning of the interview, being very violent and offensive. And the one thing that makes that interesting for young Danish people is that I react back, which is very contrary to Danish values. Because, as I told you, if somebody's very angry and crying and yelling and maybe even threatening violence, the Danish response to that will be to be calm and temperate and say, we'll relax, we don't have a problem, we'll sort it out. But what I do is I say, well, you just insulted my people and my country, so here's the mirror, and I'll insult you back. And they're not used to that, because their power in social settings is based on Danes not reacting like that, based on Danes being afraid of them, based on Danes being afraid of being hit by them, or even murdered or raped by them, which happens all the time.
What's your vision of a perfect Denmark? What would you like Denmark to look like?
Well, I mean, Denmark in the 1950s was very nice. Of course, it's nicer. The technological advance has made some progress, but Denmark in the 1950s was ethnically homogenous. There were only Danes living here.
That's what you want.
Yes.
Are you racist?
Racist? No, I don't think that you should treat people differently under the law based on their race, but I also don't think that that you should really sort people into races. It's very difficult to do that, I think, because
You talk about Muslims a lot.
that's not a race.
Right, it's a faith.
Yes.
Right.
Why is that difficult for you to understand?
So nothing's difficult for me to understand.
Well, you ask about racism and then you mention Muslims, and you have to correct yourself and acknowledge that Muslims are not a race. So that would lead me to think that it is difficult for you to understand that Muslims are not a race. That's the reason I asked you this. But
you talk a lot about people that are born elsewhere,
yes.
that are of different races, that are
No.
different. Right.
I talk about people who are born elsewhere that are of different cultures and different religions. You're the one who is using the word race here.
But I mean, there was a conviction recently, right, that you're challenging.
Yes,
Yeah.
but that was
So it's not an unreasonable question.
what is not unreasonable. Well,
whether you're a racist.
it's absolutely an unreasonable question, but the statement that you made is another lie. You said you talk a lot about people from other countries and from other races, and that is a blatant lie.
Right.
So that's why I take offense. Now, if I was a Muslim, of course you know how I would react then, but fortunately I'm not. So therefore I'm just reacting like most Danes do, which is with temperance and just acknowledging that what you said just now was not true, that I do not talk about people from other races. What I have done is I've talked about people from Africa. Now obviously people from Africa for the most part are black. There's no denying that. I don't think that's necessarily a race. I think that probably there are many black people in Africa who are many different kinds of races, if you want to go into that. I think it's difficult to establish what kind of race one person is. But certainly I've made statements about people in different African countries based on their nationality, and in some cases based on their ethnic group. Now that's interesting in some cases, because in African countries the average IQ, for instance, is quite low compared to Western European countries. And that's interesting if you look at the problems African countries have. And then you can look at the problems that countries have if they have an average high IQ, and then you can conclude that for the most part, countries with an average high IQ, they have far fewer problems than countries with an average low IQ. So that's something I've talked about, but obviously that's something that many professors and researchers in psychology are talking about all the time. They're spending their lives talking about this and researching this, and that's that.
So if we meet young Muslims, for example, from Iraq, from Iran, in places like Formosa, and they say, well, this guy, he's a racist. Are they wrong to interpret you that way?
Absolutely.
Are they wrong to see you that way?
Absolutely.
Even though they feel that you repeatedly target them?
Well, I don't know who these people are.
Sure.
If you're a person from Iraq who is an atheist or a Christian, and you support the Danish society by working, and you love the Danish way of life, and for instance you were born here, then you're a valued foreigner. Then we want you to stay, and we're happy that you're staying. So if those people are someone you've spoken to, I find it very unlikely that they would make those statements, because those people that I've just described are smart enough to understand my policies very well. And they're quite happy actually with my policies, for a very good reason, because Denmark would be such a nicer place for them if all the other people from foreign countries that are not behaving well would leave. Certainly if you're a nice person from Iraq who is loving Denmark, who is embracing the Danish religion, who is working and supporting yourself and others, it's a lot nicer to walk down the street in Denmark if you know that all the foreigners in Denmark are just like that, because then the Danes would know that as well. But I think reasonably the people you've spoken to are not those kinds of people. It's far more likely, if you've spoken with people from Volsmosa, that they're the kinds of people who did what happened to a guy last summer in Volsmosa, where a 15-year-old boy was stripped of his clothes. He was beaten by a gang of Muslims who were about the same age, and he was also threatened on his life, and there was used pepper spray on him, and then he was filmed all during this and forced to walk away naked with his underpants around his ankles. Now it's far more likely that those are the kinds of people you've spoken to. Now,
but as you say, you don't know.
No, I don't know, but you're just mentioning people from Iraq and Iran, and you're mentioning that they're from Volsmosa. And I'm just saying that if they were people who love Danish values and support themselves with working, then it's very unlikely that they would say to you or anybody else that they feel targeted by me and our party's policies. Because then they would know, they would be bright enough to understand that they are not our targets. Our targets are the people who are destroying our country. And of course there are many of those in Volsmosa. If you've done your research, and I'm kind of getting the feeling you haven't done that at all, but fortunately you have time for something called post-production, so maybe you still have time for that. You'll understand that during the election I tried numerous times to enter Volsmosa to hold peaceful rallies there so that I could explain about my policies and so forth. And the one place I wanted to go the most was the one place I could never go, Beach Square. Beach Square is impossible for me to enter because that's where all the criminals live. And even if you had vast police resources, it was quite impossible to secure my safety. I came as far as being in a car, a very, very secure car, driven by the police security intelligence service during the election campaign, that was there for maybe a minute or a minute and a half before it had to leave without getting out of it.
Why?
Because the amount of people attacking us and the police there were so numerous that it was not safe for me to even exit the car, even though there were maybe 50, 60, 70.
So what's the problem with you?
Sorry?
What do you think the problem is with you going there?
Well, the problem is that the people there, they don't like me or my policies, and therefore they react with violence. And that's the reason the police could not control that, because when they are very, very numerous, which they were then and have been at many other times, then the police cannot control that area, even though the police are also numerous. But there is plenty of footage there, so you should look that up if you're unable to understand this. But I'm thinking maybe it's unnecessary for me to...
Sorry, where
Sorry.
are you?
You're okay? Oh, sorry.
Maybe it's, I mean, I'm getting the feeling I shouldn't really mention all these facts, because if your perspective is to paint that it's very sad for all those rapist, violent people from Iraq and Iran, that a Dane is telling them that they should go back, then we don't need facts anymore. So if that's your perspective, if that's your angle and your story and your pitch, then there's no point in me telling you the facts, because you'll just ignore them. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think I don't think that they should be pitied. I don't think that if you come here from Iraq or Iran, I would say that it's far more Iraq than Iran, because Iranians, Persians generally do a lot better in Denmark than Iraqis and Arabs do. But it's not a shame that if you come here from Iraq, or even if you're born here by Iraqi parents, and you start out your life in Denmark when you're just entering puberty by hitting other people, mostly Danes, and then raping Danish girls, and maybe also stabbing Danish guys, then I think it's probably that person, the rapist, knife attack, scum, thug, that's the bad guy, and not me. And absolutely, there will be some Iraqis who are able to speak calmly with you But maybe what you should have done in those interviews, instead of being their complacent white slave, what you should have done is, no, it's just because it's so obvious to me that you have no objectivity. You're completely bound by your personal beliefs, and that is completely destroying any shred of independence that you might have in your work. But that's why I use the word white slave, because you're just saying whatever, follows your agenda. But if you took a Quran there and you said, I've taken the Quran here, now I'm going to put some bacon and some dog shit on it, and then we'll continue the interview. If you'd done that, and they had remained completely calm and polite, and there were 10 of them in the room, and only you and the cameraman as well, I would be completely convinced. If that was the case, and you told me this and had evidence, I would say, well, they seem like very controlled people, they seem like good guys. But of course, at least I know that's never going to happen. And I would even go so far as to say that maybe you may also be in a position someday to understand that that would never happen. Because in Arab culture, there is not something like there is in Western European culture where you can meet each other on equal footing. That concept doesn't exist in Arab culture. No, there's either the concept of you being very subservient and showing a lot of humility, or there's the concept of you being very dominant and ordering people around and being very humiliating towards them. Those are the two positions you can have in Arab culture. And of course, if you are with a group of Australians, and maybe you are 10, and you meet one guy who is an Iraqi, for instance, then he will choose the first position. He will be very subservient and polite and so forth. But if you're walking around and being one person and saying that you think Muhammad is a terrible child rapist and that Islam is a stupid religion, and you're saying that to 20 Arabs standing on the corner, then they will be in the second position. And that's something that's very different between Arab culture and Danish culture. Because if you said that about the Bible to 20 Danish guys on the corner, and we're playing with the thought that they're all Christians, more or less, just for the exercise here, they wouldn't hit you for that reason. They would maybe engage you and ask you why you have that opinion. So that's the difference. But to be true to your original question, obviously the Iraqis you spoke with don't like me when they know in their heart that they are what I described that they are. If they were not criminal thugs and losers, they would not be offended by what I said. Because I have not said that all Muslims in Denmark are criminal thugs and losers, because that's obviously not the case. Quite the contrary, a minority of Muslims in Denmark are criminal thugs and losers. So if you are being offended by being called a criminal thug or me calling people criminal thugs and losers, that's because you choose to take that label upon yourself and think, he's probably talking about me when he's saying that because that person has been convicted of violence and so forth. So obviously, if you're speaking with people who in reality are convicted of violent crimes, who in reality know that they are now losers and will remain losers because they have no prospects, they have no jobs and so forth, then it's very natural that they don't like me because they are bright enough to understand. That doesn't require more than a 75 IQ, that the people I'm talking about throwing out of Denmark and sending back to where they came from will probably be those people, first on the list. So that's the reason they don't like me, and I understand that. I don't blame them for that. If I was in their position, I wouldn't like me either. But they're not the people I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for the Danes. So what Iraqis and Iranians think about me is really not interesting. Unless, of course, Iraqis and Iranians in Iraq and Iran think they're looking very forward to all their countrymen being sent back. In that case, I'm quite interested in that opinion from the people living there. But as far as Iraqis and Iranians living in Denmark, and I would have to assume that they are Iraqis and Iranians because that's what you called them. You didn't say they were Danes, so I guess we agree on that then, that they're Iraqis and Iranians. Their opinion is only interesting to me the day after hell freezes over.
all of this talk of Danish culture and its sort of superiority, as you seem to describe it.
No, I do not seem to describe it like that.
How do you?
It's very interesting. You know, I've spoken with many journalists from all over the world, and I'm fine with critical journalists, but I have to say that you have accomplished something in your life, because you're without a doubt the most culturally Marxist journalist from elsewhere that I've ever met. So every question
you don't know anything about me.
Oh yes, based on the way you're asking questions, I know a lot.
Right.
And your premises in every question is culturally Marxist.
Right.
I have not said that Danish culture is superior. I've just said that we like Danish culture a lot and we want it to remain the way it is. Now, certainly I've said that the average IQ in Denmark is more than it is in, for instance, South Africa, but it's also less than it is in China and South Korea and Hong Kong. Hong Kong is basically China, but for some reason they're listed independently when it comes to IQ. That doesn't mean that I think that South Korea, China, and Hong Kong have a superior culture to Danes, even though they have a higher average IQ. So that's really not the issue. What you have heard me say is, I wish the very best for the Muslims in the 51 Muslim countries in the world. It would make me very happy if they're very happy there. Obviously, I would be far more happy if Danes are happy in Denmark, because I fight for the happiness of Danes. But once that's accomplished, I'm very happy if other people are happy as well. Of course, it's not really easy for them to be happy, because when they are Muslim and have a Muslim country, that kind of, you know, it makes it very difficult for them to have a happy country, unfortunately, for them. And that's the reason they all come here, because their religion and their culture makes for a terrible country, and most of them don't want to live there. So then they come here and enjoy our money and our happiness and our freedom, and then they want to turn our country into a Muslim country. So there's a cognitive dissonance there. They don't understand that the very thing they're running away from is something they're trying to create here as well. That, I guess you could say, is a superior Danish culture, but that's basically based on the fact that those countries are shithole nations. And I would imagine that some people in Australia think about the same about Australia. I mean, if that wasn't the case, I can't see why Australia would be so, some people say, draconian to actually take refugee and asylum seekers and put them on tropical islands far away from Australia coastline. I mean, wouldn't that possibly be because maybe some Australians think that Australia is pretty good the way it is and maybe it shouldn't change too much? I'm thinking that's probably the reason. So it's not like my concept of enjoying Denmark for Danes is completely alien to Australians. Quite the contrary, it's actually very easy for Australians to understand. But here's another bright fact that you may not have thought about. It's also very easy for Saudi Arabians to understand, and for Iranians, and for Iraqis and Syrians and Lebanese, because people in all those countries don't want migrants either. They want their countries to remain ethnically completely homogeneous, and also religiously homogeneous and so forth. So it's difficult to understand really why the Iraqis have such a problem with a Danish politician wanting an ethnically homogeneous Denmark, when all Iraqis in Iraq want an ethnically homogeneous Iraq.
We've just gone through a shift change of the security guards. I reckon we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
You got everything you need?
Yeah.
Cool.
One thing I'm interested though in, Rasmus, is you described Sharia law and the particular, you know, throwing gays off roofs and things like that. There's a large body of Muslims in Denmark, some from Pakistan, some from Syria, some from Arabia.
Unfortunately, yes, I'm trying to make me sad. It's true. Yes, you're reminding me.
Just tell me where you want to know.
But no, I'm just interested, like, not all of those subscribe to Sharia. There may be some small amount who are extremists.
That's not true based on what the questionnaires have been taken out.
No, just let me finish.
Okay. Yeah.
So you said before there's a small number who are really extremist. Isn't that the problem? And like 95% could become fruitful, contributing people to the Danish culture.
Well, there's no historical evidence of that ever going to happen. There's plenty of historical evidence of the contrary, because if you look at history, I mean, I could answer that with many different points. I could make the theological answer as well, but let's just focus on the historical answer. If you look at history, there is only two kinds of outcome, really. There's the outcome which I would call the Iberia Peninsula outcome, which is the Muslims come to the Iberia Peninsula and then eventually they're thrown out by St. James and so forth. And that's the one outcome. And the other outcome, of course, is the Middle East and many other places, the entire northern part of Africa, that they come to places that are Christian or something else, and then eventually that place is completely Muslim. So those are the two possibilities.
That's what you fear might happen here.
Well, no, that's not a fear.
Okay.
That's a mathematical certainty. If the current development is not changed, that's a mathematical certainty, because Muslims here have far more children than Danes do. That's what's called the Great Replacement. And it's not just a conspiracy theory, it's actually just mathematics. I mean, it may be a conspiracy theory if you think some people are behind it. That may be a conspiracy theory. I don't really think that. Some people do, but I don't. But it doesn't really matter that much to me, though, because I'm just focused on the math. And it's very easy. You don't have to be a professor in math to know that if Danes get very few children and they get them very late in life, and Muslims here get a lot of children, I think 7 or so, and they get them very early in life, then it will just be a matter of time before that happens. And I mean, I'm not sure what the case is in Australia, but I think the case in Australia is far less grave than this here.
Well, then what's the difference between ethnic homogeneity, which you were just describing you want, and just a plain racist view? What's the difference?
Well, the difference is that an ethnic preference is the right of each country to decide who they want to live in that country. Whereas a racist view is to say, we have 2 people for a job, and the person who we believe is of the black race is far more qualified than the person who we believe is of the white race, but we choose the white person regardless because he's white. That's the racist view.
But this idea of ethnic homogeneity is just a far more expanded version of that same idea, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Because you're saying all these people that are different from you, you want them out.
Yes, absolutely. And that's
so
not, no,
isn't
that's
that just plain old racism?
No, it's not, because racism is based on presumptions that are not true, on biases, on perceptions that are against reality about certain people. For instance, the perception that if you are a certain race, then you behave in a certain way. What I've spoken to you about and tried to explain, although maybe not to great effect, for the past 2 hours or so, or 1.5 hours, is that cultures are compatible or less compatible with Danes, and that's what we're talking about. You haven't heard me say anything.
Then you went on to say, I want ethnic homogeneity.
Yeah. You asked me what my supreme goal was, but certainly I don't have a problem with the Vietnamese living here, continuing to live here, even though they're not ethnic Danes. The Vietnamese living in Denmark have a lower violence index than Danes do. So that means that on a whole, they're less violent than Danes are. So obviously I like Vietnamese in Denmark a lot. I don't like 5 million Vietnamese in Denmark, but certainly within a reasonable amount I do, as I like Japanese and Chinese and Philippines and Thais and so forth, and most Europeans and most Australians. I think you get my point. So that's not racist at all. But if I were to say, if somebody was to say, we don't want anybody in Denmark so-and-so because of the color of their skin, that might be racist. But on the other hand...
So it's just about the language. Because it's the same effect.
No, it's not about the language. It's about the culture. It's about the culture and the religion. And however long you argue that it's about race, it's not true. But you have to understand that concept. I mean, it's very interesting. I'm usually, I don't speak with cultural Marxists, so this is a very interesting interaction for me. I'm really getting something for my time here. We as a country have a right to decide who we want to live here. And we also have a right to decide, by whatever premise we want, who we want to live here. Also, that same right goes for every country in the world. So if you wanted to decide that only people with a very bright skin tone could be allowed to live here, that would be fine. There's nothing wrong with that, though that's certainly not the position, nor is it my position, because I think it's a matter of culture. I don't think you can look at someone and based on how big a nose they have or what their skin tone is, decide that they are one way or another. But you can certainly do so based on their behavior. And when we see cultures where the behavior overall is in a certain way, then we are at complete liberty to decide that we don't want those cultures here, as Australia is, and we are exercising that right already, as is Australia and as is Italy and Poland and Hungary. The only difference is that Italy and Poland and Hungary are exercising those rights far more effectively, because Salvini and Orban and the Polish leadership, they're not taking any shit any longer. I mean, you could say that the culture Marxists, your allies, have lost those three countries because the citizens of those three countries have decided, well, we like things the way they are. We don't want to be enriched by people who want to kill our women if they're being raped and therefore have sex outside of marriage because they're being raped. We don't really subscribe to that idea. I mean, sure, if Muslim countries do that, I guess that's their prerogative, but as a Pole, we don't want that. I think that's the position of Poles, and I can certainly sympathize with that position. So that's that. But also, as far as Sharia goes, it's certainly not true. The statistics are very clear. It's about 78% of Danish Muslims, based on those research, they support that Sharia law should be above the Danish law. And also, it will be very unlikely that it will be less, because you cannot be a Muslim and you cannot be a Muslim and not subscribe to Sharia, because Sharia is a core part of Islam. Obviously, you can be a Muslim and not enforce Sharia if you don't have the means to do so, and that's the case in Denmark. The Muslims here, for the most part, don't have the means to do so, but they did have the means to show what they're like if they're outside the reach of the law. They have had those opportunities. They've had those opportunities several times in Volsmose, where your new Arab friends are living and where maybe you should move. I would certainly invite you to move there for a few months and get so enriched that you have never been so enriched before. But also in Nørrebro on the 14th of April and in Aarhus and Bispehaven during the election, there they had the opportunity to show what they're like when the police are no longer in control. And that was extreme rioting, and that was danger to other people, and that was destroying other people's property. And in all those cases, well, not on the 14th of April. On the 14th of April, just 2 days before the police told me there was a threat on my life and I had to be driven away. But in the other two cases I mentioned, Aarhus and Odense, the second and third largest city of Denmark, I went there and I was told after a very brief period of time, we now have a specific threat on your life. You have to leave now. We are taking you whether you want it or not. Okay? So that's all your peace-loving Arabs. So, I mean, if you love them so much, can't they just leave with you? I mean, maybe you want your neighborhood in Australia to be enriched. And I mean, maybe we came off on the wrong foot, but really I'll be very helpful to you if you do me that small favor. Could you please take the 700,000 Muslims from Denmark that you love so much, that are so peaceful, that are so helpful and everything, just take them with you to your neighborhood in Australia. I would be very much in your debt, and then you would have proven me wrong. I think you're kind of a, you know, I don't have the best idea about you, but I can be wrong, and I'm willing to apologize. Do me that one favor, and then we'll be best friends for the rest of our lives. And I will speak very highly of you, Hamish, forever. Okay.
Thank you.
Hamish, just one thing I remembered.
No, let's leave it there.
Okay, but
We're ahead.
okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure, you know, you can...
I think we'll be here all day if we keep doing it. Yeah.
Unfortunately, when I get something, I have... It's not easy with the brief answers.
Yeah, no, you're a lawyer, I can tell.
So, let me know, though, because, you know, I would be very happy. Everything negative I said